Regulations around the lockdown have raised questions about compliance as well as vulnerable members of society. Stanley Malematja from the Centre of Applied Legal Studies joins us now via Skype. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. South Africa is in lockdown, so explain to us what's a regulation and what's a law or an act, and do they carry the same weight?
Good afternoon to all the viewers. Yes, we are indeed in a very unique situation, and a regulation rather emanates from a law. The law which gave cost to the regulations is the Disasters Management Act. So that act actually allows the state to call for, to impose a state of disaster, which then leads to a situation in which we are in, which is a lockdown. So basically, the Disasters Management Act allows for the state to take preventative measures for the curbing of a disaster. And the disaster that we are currently facing right now is the COVID-19. So the lockdown is actually taken with efforts to try and flatten the curve. So it is a preventative measure.
Mm-hmm. South Africa's constitution is often praised as being among the best in the world, if not the best, especially when it comes to our Bill of Rights and how certain rights, such as the right to trade, the right to freedom of movement and expression, are protected. These rights are now being curtailed. Explain to us how that's legal and how that works.
Yes, our Bill of Rights is actually, it's a living document. It is the cornerstone of our Constitution. What we need to bear in mind is that not all the rights in the Constitution are absolute. So other rights actually can be limited. And if, for example, you look at the right to gather, the right to freedom of assembly, that right on its own, it has what we call internal qualifiers or internal limitations, which is peaceful and unarmed. So, and also when a right is being limited, it is not, the limitation does not come from a vacuum. We are actually guided by Section 36 of our Constitution, which is termed the limitation clause. So basically, Section 36 of the Constitution allows for the limitation of the rights in the Bill of Rights, provided that that limitation is done through a law of general application. And what we are seeing now, the regulations and also the Disaster Management Act is a law of general application, in that it does not apply to a specific person, but it rather applies to everyone within the borders of the Republic. And also the limitation must be in accordance, it must speak to human dignity, equality, and freedom. And also when we limit, we have to look at the nature of the right. We have to look at the importance of the limitation. And also we need to look at whether do we have any other less restrictive measures that we can put into place. Indeed, the right to freedom of movement, the right to freedom of trade has been limited. But if we take that right and look through it in terms of Section 36 of the Constitution, one can possibly argue, and correctly so, that the limitation is justifiable in an open and democratic society based on human dignity and freedom. Because the limitation actually, it is aimed at a greater purpose. It is aimed at preserving lives, number one, and also it is aimed at curbing the spread of the COVID-19. Now, the question that comes into mind, did the government have any less restrictive measures that it could take, to try and flatten the curve? No, it didn't have, because how else do we, if it has been proven that the virus spreads when people are gathering, it's a respiratory virus. So one of the measures to try and curb the spread is that people must be in self-isolation. So yes, being in self-isolation does restrict one's right to freedom of movement, but that limitation on that right is justifiable because it is for a greater cause, and it doesn't only limit the movement of a particular group of people. It actually applies to everyone who's within the borders of the Republic.
Okay, let's talk about the more vulnerable members of society, such as perhaps a homeless person who doesn't have access to information as they should, or a single parent who has to work during lockdown, and therefore those groups of people are contravening regulations knowingly or unknowingly. What happens then?
So, I mean, what happens is that the regulations are very clear when one contravenes, the lockdown rules. They are very clear. It is a criminal offense. Therefore, it means that one must be subjected to the criminal justice system and therefore be given their day in the criminal court for a court to make a finding. But now, what we have seen actually with these regulations is that it has magnified the inequality that is entrenched in the South African society, right? It has rather placed us in a situation where we have situations where someone is unable. There's that inability to comply with the rules. And then there's those people who just fail to comply with the rules. So when we talk about failure, is that you have all the resources that allow you to comply with the regulations, but rather you fail. Now, but when we talk about the inability, is that the situation that you are in at that particular moment does not allow you to, it does not permit you to comply with the rules. Therefore, even when you break the rules, you break them involuntarily. The example that you've given about people, homeless people who do not have, access to information, right? But now what we have seen is that we've seen our government really taking a progressive step towards that, housing people, homeless people, housing them and actually keeping them away from the public. But, given the inequality in South Africa, that is not enough. We still have people who are in shared dwellings where isolation is highly impossible, where these people, immediately when they step out of their shack, they actually step into a public road, and we cannot control, you cannot dictate to your neighbor in the shared dwellings as to what time that person must step out of their shack, as to what time that person must go to the communal tap to fetch water. So there's a lot of situations in South Africa, and those are prompted by the inequality that are actually making people unable to comply with the rules. They are not failing, they are rather unable. It is involuntary. When you are failing to comply, it is a voluntary situation where you have all the mechanisms before you that allow you to comply with the regulations, but you choose not to. But when you are in a situation, for example, where you are a shared dweller and you're staying in a crammed up place and you share a communal tap with 5 other households, you are actually placed in a situation where you are unable to comply. But now, I mean, the regulations state clearly that if one violates the rules, then it is a criminal offense. So, but that's what we have seen. Yeah.
Stanley Malematja from the Center of Applied Legal Studies joining me via Skype. I'd love to continue that conversation and take a look at also the implications of courts and how they're going to deal with an influx of cases that come from people violating lockdown regulations, perhaps another day. Let's